Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Having looked at hard war and the struggle for the state's rivers, we conclude our fourth week by examining the Union Army's tenuous hold upon Missouri through 1862. We pick up our narrative after the rebel victory at Lexington and the Jayhawker raids through western Missouri. In late 1861, the state's secessionist leaders attempted to formalize their ties to the Confederacy, but they remained a government in exile. Federal victories, both along the rivers and in the Ozarks, kindled hope that the Union had established a kind of stability. An 1862 report from Union officer John Schofield, the commander of Unionist militia in the whole state, found, quote, "Missouri was quiet, and there seemed no reason to apprehend any further serious difficulty," end quote. Such confidence, it soon became clear, was premature. We end today by looking at the experiences of Civil War soldiers on both sides. Enthusiasm from the war's first year now began to fade, and the acute challenges faced by these men came into focus as the war dragged on. By the start of October 1861, in the weeks just after victory at Wilson's Creek and at Lexington, it looked as though that the wind was at the back of Missouri Confederates. This moment, I would say, more than any other during the war, was when things looked brightest. Missouri Unionists sensed this pro-Confederate momentum. In October, the Unionist State Convention met again. A previous meeting had anticipated that a statewide election would be held the following month, but it now seemed clear that secessionists would surely win a November election, giving their strength in southern and western Missouri. Faced with this hard political reality, Provisional Governor Hamilton Gamble does two things. First, he recommends that the election be postponed, and the convention thus agreed to move back the election date to the first Monday in August 1862, so almost a year later. Then, they hoped, the Union prospects in the state would hopefully be brighter. Second, a test oath to determine citizens' loyalties would be required of all Missourians. All civil officials who refused this oath within 60 days would see their positions declared vacant. Such was the controversial method of keeping political control in a bitterly divided state. To the extent of this disorder, I think, will become clearer in the next video or two. Missouri was a complicated place at the start of the Civil War, and as we move into the second and third years, things only get worse. You'll recall that back in August 1861, before Wilson's Creek, displaced Governor Claiborne Jackson had declared that Missouri was a sovereign and independent state. It wasn't until October that the exiled secessionist legislators who gathered in the town of Neosho in the southwestern corner voted to secede. That vote came 7 months after Missouri delegates rejected secession decisively. Historians have also disputed this vote because the assembly at Neosho lacked a proper quorum. On November 28th, however, the Confederate Congress at the new capital in Richmond formally accepted the vote, making Missouri the 12th state in the Confederacy. In December, secessionist Governor Claiborne Jackson traveled to New Orleans with Jeff Thompson to secure both the weapons and the state bonds that the October secession of the rebel legislature had approved. Thompson would use these bonds to pay his troops for the first time in several months. Just before Christmas, Jefferson Davis sent word to Missouri, seeking reorganization of state troops under Confederate control in order to improve the coordination that I talked about last time. The following month, the Confederate Congress ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to advance Missouri $1 million. In March 1862, the rebel members of Missouri's 21st General Assembly met at New Madrid for what turned out to be their final meeting. Only a few legislators, and no sign of Claiborne Jackson, were there. The fugitive governor had purchased a home in the Red River country of Texas, with the intent of moving his family there. Jackson never fulfilled his hopes of returning to power in Jefferson City. He would die on December 7, 1862, just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. His successor, the Lieutenant Governor, Thomas C. Reynolds, moved the state seal and the remaining state records in his possession to Missouri's new Confederate capital, which, of course, was in Texas, at the town of Marshall. This diminished government in exile became an apt metaphor for the rebels' fading prospects within Missouri. The rebels' difficulty resulted from an inability to dislodge Federals from the state of Missouri. In our last lecture, I described how Union forces had secured the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. At roughly the same time, the Union Army managed to reclaim other parts of the state. An expedition under John Pope defeated Sterling Price's forces in west central Missouri, forcing them southward towards Springfield. John C. Fremont now moved towards Springfield with 38,000 men of his own. He was eager to destroy Price's army and to rebuild his reputation that had been so badly damaged by his confrontation with President Lincoln. The most notable part about Fremont's campaign was the raid by Charles Zagonyi and 300 of Fremont's own bodyguards in the town of Springfield on October 25th. Zagonyi's charge helped the Union retake the town, which had fallen into rebel hands after Wilson's Creek, but their victory could not redeem Fremont. He was relieved of his command at last in early November and reassigned to Virginia, where his later service did little to justify his lofty self-image. After Fremont, Henry Halleck took command of Union forces in Missouri. He was struck by the fighting between rival Union officers in the state, including Samuel Curtis and Franz Sigel. Poor decisions by Sigel had contributed to Union defeats at both Carthage and Wilson's Creek. Yet he retained strong political support amongst German Americans in St. Louis. In February 1862, Federal troops under Curtis drove Price's guardsmen from Missouri. The rebels joined Confederate troops under Earl Van Dorn in Arkansas. But in early March, Curtis defeated this combined force at the Battle of Pea Ridge. This came at nearly the same moment that Union forces captured New Madrid in the southeast. Confederate defeat at Pea Ridge, this marked a key turning point in the war for Missouri. It effectively ended rebel hopes for the state, which would only be revived for a time in 1864. After the Battle of Pea Ridge, many of the men under Price formally entered the service of the Confederate military. They were transferred to fight east of the Mississippi River. But this victory for the Union belied deeper challenges that remained within Missouri. The finances of the provisional government, for example, were not strong. After authorizing the issuance of Union defense bonds, $1 million worth, Hamilton Gamble turned to Washington, D.C. for more support. And this is a common theme by Missouri leaders, going to Washington. Help us. Please help us. A growing number of Missourians, especially in the countryside, were increasingly hostile toward the Federal troops in their midst. Gamble was a conservative Unionist himself, and he believed that the creation of a Unionist state militia might be better received by Missourians. This idea was one of many things that divided the governor from John C. Fremont, who had resisted it as a threat to his authority. Lincoln tried to steer between these two positions. The presidents proposed that Washington arm and pay the Unionist Missouri State Militia, but only if the troops could be directed by the Union commander in St. Louis. This turned out to be Brigadier General John Schofield, who had once been Nathaniel Lyon's chief of staff. This compromise promised to free up Federal troops for service elsewhere. It was an arrangement that would be in place through the war's end. As many as 75,000 Missouri men fought for these Unionist militia. A large number of them likely would have fought and served the Federal cause elsewhere without it. And so to recap, because here's where Missouri gets a bit confusing. There was a Missouri State Guard. That was the pro-Confederate state militia that had existed near the start of the war. And it had been controlled by Claiborne Jackson and then Sterling Price. This new Unionist Missouri State Militia, they were Missouri fighters funded by the federal government. And to complicate matters even more, next week we'll introduce another group, the Enrolled Militia of Missouri, which was organized to deal with guerrilla violence. Missouri was a mess by the middle of the Civil War. The Unionist state militia helped to maintain control of Missouri. But as guerrilla warfare plunged the state deeper into chaos, this control was always tenuous. When it came time for that scheduled election in August 1862, the Gamble administration decided that the situation remained too volatile and postponed the election of executive offices yet again. They were now to be contested in 1864. Southern sympathizers howled in protest. Elvira Scott from Saline County wrote of the postponement, "And this is free America, with her boasted Republican institutions? What a mockery." There was, however, an election for seats in the state legislature, and Unionist leaders who supported emancipation were now able to seize control of the assembly. And so we're nearing a political tipping point in the state. There were two Unionist factions at this point. The so-called Clay Banks were led by Gamble and by Frank Blair, and the Charcoals were led by B. Gratz Brown of St. Louis. The Charcoals favored immediate and uncompensated emancipation. They're the more radical of the two factions. This rift foreshadows important divisions that become even more prominent as the war nears its end. The outcome of the election was clearly influenced by the test oath that Gamble had instituted. The test oath simply denied rebel access to the polls. And as a result, unlike 1861, when there had been 170,000 Missourians voting to choose delegates for that secession convention, in 1862, barely half that total cast votes, about 82,000. Missouri entered the second year of Civil War even more divided than it had been at the start. A brief look at the men who were fighting in the state helps to illuminate the depth of those divisions. These soldiers include both Unionist and pro-Confederate volunteers from Missouri, as well as Missourians who entered the regular service of the United States and Confederate militaries. After 1862, Confederate forces remain a threat along Missouri's periphery. There are also a growing number of irregular guerrilla fighters within the state. They will be the focus of a later week. And lastly, you have federal troops coming into Missouri from across the north, from Iowa, west or east to New England, Kansas. And so you have a mix of fighters here. Many Missourians look upon federal troops, especially these northerners from outside of the state, with suspicion and hostility, especially after Camp Jackson. They're particularly critical of German American troops in the state. Union troops, for their part, were sharply critical of the locals they encountered. Even in this ostensibly loyal state, Northern soldiers conflated residence in a slave state with support for the Confederacy. They become synonymous, missing the fact that a substantial number of Missouri households still sympathized with the North. You can see this kind of prejudice creeping into the letters that soldiers wrote home. Webster Moses, a Union sergeant from Maine, wrote that the town of Clinton bore the depressing scars of a slave-holding society. He noted, quote, "The inhabitants here are most all very ignorant, and consequently secesh. The curse of slavery is visible. Business has been neglected, and houses are going to decay. They need a little Yankee enterprise here," end quote. As guerrilla violence became endemic, fueled, it seemed, by the support of local families, this mistrust only festered. Life for soldiers in Missouri, as in the rest of the country, was not easy. Their diets were unvaried, often consisting of little more than salt pork and hardtack. The latter, hardtack, was a kind of biscuit made from flour, water, maybe a little bit of salt. Its great virtues were its durability, its portability, its low cost. Among its disadvantages, it could be as hard as a rock and just about as tasty. And you can make your own, of course. Go on the internet, Google recipe hardtack, and you can try it for yourself and see what life as a Civil War soldier was sometimes like. As troops found themselves farther from home with their supply lines stretched thin, they were often at the mercy of local farmers These producers took advantage of soldiers' hunger to sell them fruit, milk, other goods, usually at inflated prices. What soldiers from each side could not find, they often took, foraging from the surrounding countryside. As troops moved through the state, they usually marched on foot. By the war's first winter, many soldiers' boots were in poor shape. Some had no shoes at all. Observers noted in 1861, at the beginning, that some men had worn out their pants and had taken to wearing sacks. Think about the effects of these material hardships in extreme weather, both in the heat but really in the cold, marching hundreds of miles through the sun, through the wind, through the rain, through the snow, the ice. Ice is terrible in many parts of Missouri. And this matters a great deal because the material support that soldiers will receive will become even more disparate by war's end as the federal war effort is able to continue to churn out both armaments but also the uniforms, and the farms are producing this food, and the South is struggling to feed and to sustain its forces. Soldiers' letters often describe these difficulties, but also the unremitting boredom of their service. They broke up the monotony by writing letters, reading, playing games, drinking, engaging in the kinds of mischief that you might expect of young men in their late teens and early 20s. The letters of Henry Cheevens reveal the myriad challenges that volunteers faced. Cheevens had been a Boone County school teacher. Born in Pennsylvania, he'd gone to college at Yale and then Amherst, and later joined the Missouri State Guard. He fought at Wilson's Creek, where he was wounded. At times in his service, few things seemed to go right. His military kit had included a blanket, a rifle, a Bowie knife, but he quickly lost the blanket and then his coat. He broke his glasses. He then fell victim to a horrible bout of diarrhea. In his case, snake root proved to be the thing that helped him most. Some soldiers would decide that military life was not for them. Upon the completion of their enrollments, many volunteers returned to civilian life. Other disaffected men deserted. And this would be a particular problem in the third and fourth years of the war, when these material and psychological hardships have now compounded for years. Among the men who returned home were soldiers who had been captured and paroled. This group included a rebel volunteer who had fallen sick after Wilson's Creek and was taken into custody by Union forces. In exchange for his pledge not to take up arms against the United States again, the 18-year-old returned to his family in Clay County. Within weeks, however, this young man, Frank James, took to the brush, not as a regular soldier, but as a pro-Confederate guerrilla. By war's end, his younger brother, Jesse James, would join him in resisting what they and many others saw as a hostile Union occupation. Next week, we will consider the many challenges that the Union command faced in trying to maintain order in this bitterly divided state. Until then.